Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Friday, February 19th, 2021 edition of On Iowa Politics. This week on the podcast, proposed changes to Iowa's elections are ripping through the Iowa Legislature. Chuck Grassley has a primary opponent, assuming Chuck runs again, and the latest on the ongoing assault on Iowa's first-in-the-nation caucuses. Hello, everybody. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for Lee Enterprises. With me today are Amie Rivers of the Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier. Good morning, Amie.
Good morning, Erin.
And Gazette columnist Todd Dorman. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning.
As a reminder, you can subscribe to the On Iowa Politics on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. First up this week, if it was an NFL draft prospect, it would be a cinch first rounder because it's big and it's fast. I'm talking, of course, about a new and sweeping elections bill moving through the Iowa Legislature. The bill would, among other things, make the state's early voting time frame one of the shortest in the country, ban anyone other than the individual voter from returning his or her absentee ballot, constrain county elections officials' ability to add drop boxes for completed absentee ballots or establish satellite early voting locations, create stronger punishments for county elections field officials that violate state election law, and more. Clearly, there's a lot going on in this bill, which makes one wonder why it's being advanced so quickly. The legislation was first made public on Tuesday evening, and by Thursday evening, just 48 hours later, it had passed through subcommittee and committee hearings in both chambers. And it's scheduled for a public hearing and House floor debate by Wednesday. It's not inconceivable that this bill could go from introduction to state law in little more than a week. Hey, who says the gears of government grind slowly?
Right.
Todd, setting aside the contents of this bill, we'll get to that later. Should something this significant be moving this quickly through the legislative process?
Well, no, it shouldn't. It's a complicated bill. It's got a lot of moving parts. It makes a lot of big changes, and that's the sort of thing that should be deliberated over more than a week. Excuse me. Although we've seen this legislature, at least the Republican-controlled legislature, do this before. I think it took them less than 10 days to get rid of collective bargaining for public employees. So they've moved fast before. It also tells you that they know what they're doing is not popular because they don't want to take time to listen to all the opponents of it. There are very few groups that are in favor of this, from what I've gathered. Especially, the public comments are against it. The subcommittee meetings have been dominated by people who say these are bad ideas. So I think they just want to get it done as quickly as possible. And the complicating factor this time that wasn't around with collective bargaining is that you've got a COVID pandemic where people don't want to go to the State House, where Republicans have decided that they're not going to take very many precautions. And so, people don't want to get sick, but they want to weigh in. And, a 30-minute online subcommittee isn't exactly, and online comments aren't exactly the, high impact way to weigh in on a piece of legislation. So it's fast, too fast in any circumstances, but with the pandemic, it just exacerbates the, inability of people to try to have some impact on the process.
Yeah, I can't help. You raise a really good point there. I can't help but think about, so many legislators go back to their districts and over the weekend have events where they, have to address whether it's interest groups or business groups or just general public forums. And I know a lot of those will be done virtually these days, but I know a lot of them are still doing them, and where they get grilled on what they're working on at the State House. And, I can't help but wonder if they want to minimize the conversation on this bill to just this one weekend. That it'll be done by next week, and they won't have to answer questions about it before. It's hard to, ignore the pace at which this is moving. And as you said, Todd, especially given how significant, there's some really, really big changes in this bill. Amie, has a lot of the county auditors, the local elections officials have weighed in on this. They're pretty uh, widespread in their opposition to this. Has Blackhawk County or any other folks there in the Cedar Valley weighed in on this legislation that you've heard?
I haven't talked to the auditor and I haven't seen that he's posted anything, but I did see from our Democratic contingent here in Blackhawk County, it's all Democrats that represent Blackhawk County here, and obviously they're pretty against this. Ross Smith said yesterday, interesting that the same folks that were elected via this process want to torpedo it to stay in power, and criminal charges for auditors that seek to empower the voices of Iowans. I wonder what would happen if auditors in all 99 counties decided not to comply. And Bob Kressig, similarly, was saying the Republicans plan to fast track a new voter suppression bill. So, they're really coming out pretty strongly against this and using a lot of language that you might have seen, even as far back as, a few decades ago when you're talking about voter suppression. So they're trying to rally the troops and get people against it. I think, the fast track itself is really an issue, because if you don't put the word out there and get people to send those letters, like Democrats say has been working with the school voucher bill to delay that, then if there's no widespread, letter writing campaign, commenting campaign, as Todd was talking to, that sort of makes it seem like there is that mandate out there, and that Republicans would feel good about passing something like that.
Yeah. So Todd, let's circle back to you. Amie mentioned there that Democrats say this will suppress votes. Republicans disagree with that, and they say that they acknowledge Iowa had successful elections, but this is a way to ensure that those elections continue to operate well into the future. What's your take on this bill?
Well, I think, it's going to make it far more difficult for Iowans to vote absentee. You're going to shut the window down to 18 days, which is going to, and you're also not allowing, excuse me, you're not allowing auditors to, set up satellite voting stations unless, voters petition for them. So you're going to see long lines at the auditor's office for people trying to vote early. This idea that that the auditors can't send out, absentee voter request forms is going to, make it more difficult for people who don't have a printer to print out a form, or who can't go to the auditor's office to pick one up. So it's a weird bill in that, Republicans just won basically everything. Trump won the state. They increased their legislative majority.
Todd, I'm sorry to jump in.
They took
expand on that, because one of the things that Republicans always said about when they asked if we would ask if they would change redistricting laws, is one of the things they would say is, why would we change the rules to a game that we're winning? So that's kind of the question here. Why is that? Why are Republicans doing this when, as you just noted, they've been very successful in these last few elections in Iowa?
Well, number one, Democrats still tend to vote. More Democrats tend to vote early than Republicans, and so they figure that they can, if they can hold down, curtail the number of absentee ballots, then that is an advantage for them. But number two, they, as we heard Jason Schultz in the subcommittee meeting this week, they believe that, the big lie. They believe that the election was, the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent. And so this is their way of pounding that home, even though it's not true. They're going to go ahead with it anyway. And, and they're also punishing the auditors in Johnson and Lynn and Woodbury County that had the audacity to try to send filled out absentee ballot request forms to their constituents. So there's some axe grinding, there's some big lie perpetuating, and there's some thought that this could give them some political advantage, even more than what they already have. So that's I think that's part of the motivation. And if you ask the governor what she thinks about it, she'll say, "Well, I don't comment on bills until after they've sent them to me." So, but I would imagine she would probably gladly sign this ahead of her 2022 reelection campaign, or campaign for something.
Yeah, I did manage to ask her about the early voting window part of it during one of her press conferences, and her answer didn't
Hmm.
seem to give any indication that she had
Hmm.
at least enough issue with it that she wouldn't sign the bill. So it looks like if it makes it to her desk, it'll become law. All right. Well, you hate to move on because this might be our only chance to talk about that bill on the podcast. But if it's still a live round, maybe we'll touch on it again next week. Uh, but also wanted to talk about a state senator who's looking to move on up in the world. One Iowa Republican is looking to go from Iowa senator to U.S. senator. Of course, you could debate whether that is a move up, I suppose, depending on your perspective. But Jim Carlin, a Republican state senator from Sioux City this week, announced his intention to run for Iowa's U.S. Senate seat. That means that Carlin would face longtime U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley in the Republican primary, assuming that Grassley decides to run for election. Grassley said again this week that he'll make his decision in the coming months. He's not in a hurry to make that decision. It's an interesting announcement by Carlin for that fact. Amie, does Jim Carlin know something that we don't? Do you take this as a signal that Chuck Grassley is not going to run? Does Jim Carlin think he won't have to go through Chuck Grassley, or does he not care?
I think maybe Carlin's just hedging his bet that Grassley is going to sort of come to that conclusion. Obviously, Grassley is hugely popular in the state and has been in office longer than most of us have been alive. Is that right, Todd? I'm just kidding. But
He's been in politics longer than I've been alive, so
yeah. So I mean, and he's pretty. I mean, we're talking like 60% of the vote type of popular. So Carlin really, I think, is probably, and you're going to touch on this, I'm sure, Todd, probably intending to run as the Trump candidate. Not that Grassley is a never Trumper, but Grassley is definitely more moderate, I think, than you would see from a lot of the Trump leaning state senate or federal senators from more conservative states. So I think that's probably his tack. But I really do think that maybe he thinks, even if Grassley's not saying right now what his decision is, he's definitely at an age in his late 80s where honestly things can change quickly for a person at that age, and he could very well decide sort of last minute. And then Carlin has positioned himself, to basically be the standard bearer.
Yeah. So Todd, to Amy's point, this year at the Iowa Capitol, Carlin has supported one bill that would allow employers to. It would ban employers from requiring their employees to be vaccinated. Another that would require transgender people to use the bathroom that matches their gender on their birth certificate. He spoke on the Senate floor about social media companies, and I'm air quoting here, restricting former President Trump's First Amendment rights. In his campaign announcement, he called the federal tax code an abomination, and to your point earlier, perpetuated the what's become known as the big lie, the unfounded and widely debunked claims of widespread election fraud. So Todd, is Jim Carlin lining himself up to, as Amie said, run to the right of Chuck Grassley?
well, it sounds like he's gonna try. I mean, I think probably the two ways this will go is that Grassley will announce he's running again, and Jim Carlin will sort of slide stage left and probably not file for candidacy, or he'll file for candidacy, Grassley doesn't run, and then he'll be an also ran in a field full of much bigger names. So I mean, this is a he's trying to do what candidates in a lot of states have done, and basically run on the Trump platform, and that's been successful for a lot of candidates. So I can understand why he's doing it, but I don't know if a state senator that a lot of people haven't heard of until, well, maybe still haven't heard of, is going to be, the nominee for U.S. Senate in a seat that hasn't been open since, 1980,
Right.
81.
I mean, regardless of what Chuck Grassley does, right? Because if Chuck Grassley stays in it, obviously that's a near impossible feat to beat him in a primary. And if he doesn't, to your point, there's going to be so many more candidates come out of the woodwork, and it's hard to believe that many of them won't have a much higher profile than Jim Carlin.
Well, and Grassley, I think, has done a lot of work tacking right probably over the last, 10 to 12 years. I think he was once considered a moderate, but he's gotten pretty conservative. And I think one of the big reasons is he's hoped to avoid a primary, because people have threatened before to primary him at times.
Mhm.
I think if I had to trace it back to a single moment where he started to tack right, it was probably during the Obamacare debate where he came out and said that the bill would pull the plug on grandma. And I think a lot of people were sort of, before that, he had been part of a bipartisan group that was trying to work on a health coverage plan. So when he did the pull the plug on grandma, he sort of also pulled the plug on the bipartisan negotiations at that time, and we got a bill that was only approved by Democrats. So, and since then, the partisan chasm has really only deepened. It's now, the Marianas Trench, basically nearing the core of the earth. I think is where it's headed.
All right. We will obviously have more time and more podcasts to see who else joins that race. Finally, this week we wrap up with the Iowa caucuses, which are under so much heat these days that it's starting to feel like the scorching Nevada desert. Coincidentally, Nevada legislators this week introduced legislation that would move that state's caucuses to the front of the line for the 2024 presidential election cycle. Now, of course, that in itself doesn't mean a whole lot because Iowa and New Hampshire both have similar state laws that would just move their contests ahead of Nevada. Legally, really all the Nevada bill would do is start a game of who can begin the calendar even earlier, leapfrog. But it does underscore the pressure that is being put on Iowa this time around. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. This is just another example of that. And it's also noteworthy that Nevadan and former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is backing the push to bump Nevada to the front of the line. And that's someone who still has some say in the party, is still a figure in party politics. Amie, this week at an event, Chuck Grassley said he's still betting Iowa remains first. Are you taking that bet?
Well, I'm going to hedge. I bet Iowa Republicans will remain first, right? And we've never seen this, but they could easily split their caucuses if Democrats are very much against it. And obviously, everybody read Perez's comments. And we've obviously seen this before, but if enough factors come together, and that might be the case this year, where they would move it, I would bet that Republicans try to keep their own caucus being first. I think that's a real advantage, especially in a year when you're going to expect to see more Democrats, obviously, or more Republicans than Democrats in the field. So yeah, that would be very interesting if the parties split that way. I don't believe that's happened before, has it, Todd?
Not since the
No.
very, very early days of the caucuses. Not since they became an actual thing. Todd, to Amy's point, Iowa has faced challenges like this before, and we've heard that from bipartisan places here in Iowa. Both Chuck Grassley and Rosh Wilburn, the new Democratic State Party chair, have essentially said, look, we've gone through this before, and Iowa's remained first. Is this more of the same, Todd, or does this dog have a little more bite?
Well, it in a way, it's more of the same, although the caucuses last year were a debacle, and that certainly plays into this. The question is always what, everybody wants to change it, but what do you change it to? And then
Right.
then you don't get a lot of clear answers. But Amy's right. I mean, if you see the Democrat Republican caucus alliance split, then I think Democrats are going to come out on the losing end. And I'm betting we're also going to see the long-term New Hampshire Iowa alliance split where everybody just kind of fends for themselves. So I think there is a threat, especially on the Democratic side. And, the party may decide they don't want caucuses at all, which then you've got a situation where the Democrats, maybe we try to do a primary, and that's going to, obviously cause reactions from New Hampshire and others. And so, maybe we'll be voting on, Christmas Day or something like that. But if they keep pushing it earlier and earlier. Thanksgiving primary. So
yeah, to that point, I saw someone said this week that they understand what Nevada's doing, or why Nevada's doing it, but they wonder if Nevada really knows what they're up against. And they said that, Bill Gardner up in New Hampshire, he'll hold the primary on July 4th the year before if they have to stay.
Yeah,
yeah, I read that too.
So it's such just an interesting thing, because you get into state laws and the party rules, and it's just this weird mix of rules and laws and all these myriad factors, and it's going to be interesting.
The party's never been willing to really crack the whip on this. I mean, they could come in and say, this is how we're going to do it, and if you don't do it this way, we're not going to seat your delegates. I mean, that's
right.
I mean, they have sticks and carrots, but they, over the years, they've just sort of stood by and let it work itself out. But that may change.
And then there's the argument, the suggestion to that even if they do that, Iowa could say, well, fine, we're still going to hold some kind of caucus or contest first. And basically, even if we don't get delegates out of it, we think the candidates will still show up. It's just a fascinating thing that's going on.
Maybe we should just go back to just have a summer straw poll. It was warm. There was barbecue. It was fine. Just do that.
Yeah, I like it. It'll be interesting. This is getting into opinion territory, which I hesitate, but I've always liked the idea of taking the 4 early states and running them on the same day. And I know there's reasons why that would be hard and why the different states might not be open to that. But I kind of like that as a compromise solution. I wonder if there's anything to that, from the big picture. Is that
I like that
possible?
too, because it gives you each region. You've got the West and the Midwest and the South and the Northeast.
It answers a lot of the diversity issues that people have with how white and Iowa and New Hampshire is. It takes the focus off of just 1 or 2 states. So, but as we've learned in politics, usually the best ideas have a hard time getting through somehow. So we'll see if that's the case here too. And we'll have plenty more time to talk about it on a future episode of On Iowa Politics. That's it for this week's edition. Thanks to everyone for listening. We hope it was worth your time. If you like the show, subscribe and tell a friend, and you can send fan mail to oniowapolitics@gmail.com. And don't forget, the work of everyone you heard today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier, Sioux City Journal, Mason City Globe Gazette, Muscatine Journal, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and Cedar Rapids Gazette. Lee's got to stop buying papers, or that sign-off's going to take up half of the show.
And right. the Woodbine Twiner.
Imperfekt will play us out this weekend. If you know a talented band or Iowa musician who should be featured on our show, send us a sound file. For Amie, Todd, and our producer Steve, and I'm Erin Murphy. Thanks again for listening.
I'd like to welcome you to the show. Mike Hand Recordings crew. Running things around here, just act like you knew. What? Imperfekt. It started with the microphone in my right hand and evolved into an indie label called Mike Hand Recordings. Reporting from Cedar Rapids, IA. Inner city, jump, skip, and I hop from the highway. That's where I stayed before the days of the flood, before the city was covered in muck and everybody's stuff littered the streets. I'm speaking literally. We had 6 feet of water in the kitchen at least, but that's enough on that subject, cause it'll get me upset. And I don't think you wanna see a grown man cry in the city of 5 seasons, even more smells. It ain't hard to tell, people around here are bored as hell, getting psyched for Saturdays when they're super fresh. Small place, big dreams on the road to success. Mike and the crew, the cause, collective, Midwest indigenous MCs respected. From near to far here we revere the art, taking charge of the hip-hop scene so we can raise the bar. They're faking hard, we keep it really, really real, acting like you don't know. Catch my nippy little spiel, moving swiftly on your heels, but the fact is I'm lapping you. Cause of your half-stepping attitude, melodramatic crews who never had a clue, chuckle with a bad excuse, but really, I ain't that amused. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. Now throw your hands in the air and come along with me. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. You down with MIC, H-A-N-D. Now throw your hands in the air and sing along with me. Yeah. Mike Hand, check it out, y'all. Cedar Rapids, stands up. Hip hop right under your nose. Keep me on MySpace. I'm old school, I don't fuck with that Facebook shit. Peace out. Perfect.